Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
We're live at the Miami Book Fair, powered by Life Improvement Radio on the Total Education Network Authors Corner. Again, you could go to my website, totaltutor.net, for more information. Twitter, Total Tutor, Neil S. Haley, Facebook. And Eric, we just continue, and so many interesting conversations. And it just keeps going and going and going. And last year, remember, we only went to 3, and we said, okay, and then I extended it to 4. And trust me, I would extend it to 5 if I didn't have to go grocery shopping.
I can totally relate, Neil. We've been here all weekend, and it's kind of put a hamper on normal weekend duties. But I've learned so much today. I've had a lot of fun. It's really entertaining. And I can't wait to go back and listen to these interviews again and follow up with all these great authors and see if we can get them on our individual shows, because it's been a great experience.
Absolutely. So I want to welcome to the program author Jonathan M. Katz, author of The Big Truck That Went By, How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster. Jonathan, thanks for stopping by the studio.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Oh, we're having a great time, and I'm sure you said this is your first time as an author at the Miami Book Fair, but there's nothing like the Miami Book Fair, is there?
No, it is absolutely incredible. I mean, I think I anticipated, just knowing the number of authors and the names that were on the lineup and the breadth of the subjects and the passion of the people that were coming, what it was going to be like. But I think I underestimated it. If anything, it's just an amazing space.
Absolutely, and it's interesting every year who Miami invites, and then some people that this is their book, and they might not have a book out again for another 10 years, and you're like, I can't believe I'm next to this person, and it's just wild. And I feel it in the same way of how the authors that keep coming on the show, and I'm like, wow, this person was here, and wow, that person was there. And this is the forum for you guys to talk about things, especially on Author's Corner. So let's go to specifically enough some of your background, because I think our audience really will be interested, because that really speaks to what your book's about in a lot of ways.
So I'm a journalist. I was with the Associated Press for a while, and I was for 3.5 years the Associated Press correspondent in Haiti, which means that I was actually living in Port-au-Prince on January the 12th of 2010 when a 7.0 earthquake struck about 15 miles west. And I'm sure a lot of people know the broad outlines of the story, but I experienced it in a somewhat unique way, although a way that about 3 million other people did, in that the earthquake struck the ground on which I was standing and knocked down my house around me. So I ended up staying in Haiti for another year after that and doing my job as the AP correspondent. So that involved a lot of reporting on the direct aftermath, investigations into the aid and promises of aid. And then that fall, actually, I ended up breaking the story that the United Nations peacekeepers were most likely the source of, and were definitely covering up their role in, the cholera epidemic that began, that has now killed an additional 8,500 people. So I decided that the only way to do the story justice was to try to put all of it together with my own personal experience and those investigations and these larger discussions of aid and the structures of the world, and try to figure out exactly what happened in Haiti and specifically what went wrong, why the earthquake was so deadly, and why so little has been accomplished in what's now almost 4 years since.
Well, not to give away the book, tell us a little bit more about that. What was it like? What's the experience?
Well, the earthquake itself is 40 seconds that I would not recommend anybody ever going through in their lives. I mean, look, it's an earthquake. It comes really out of nowhere, and this wasn't even. There are earthquakes in the Caribbean fairly regularly, but not in this part of Hispaniola. It's a very unusual thing. I mean, I wasn't expecting one. We sometimes talked about the possibility that one would happen, but the city was so vulnerable, and the conditions that people were living in were so prone to just the worst case scenario if an earthquake were to hit, that I think most of us just preferred not to talk about it. So the earthquake itself, it came out of nowhere. As the title suggests, we thought that many of us thought that it was a big truck pulling up. That's how life was in Port-au-Prince, and actually how it still is today, is because of the desiccation of the state, because there really aren't public services that you can count on, things like water and coming through pipes or electricity coming over a wire. You get used to these big private trucks that rumble through the city, and because the buildings are constructed so poorly, you'll often feel the building that you're in shaking as one of those trucks go by. And that's what a lot of us, including me, thought that it was. I figured it was the water truck pulling up to my house, although I was a little confused because it seemed to be coming from the other side.
Wow.
But within a couple of seconds, it became clear that this was a much bigger truck than we were expecting. And, as the science later shows, it was an earthquake basically 26 times the amount of force given off by the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945.
Oh, my gosh.
Floating underground about 15 miles away from where we were standing. So as you can imagine, it's a heck of a ride.
And I can imagine, without, like you said, there's not a lot of public works and things of that nature in there. And I would assume there's probably not a lot of the same building codes or standards that are required in other parts of the country, say America, for instance. So I can imagine it was just totally devastating to a lot of the countryside.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And I begin the book with a prologue about the collapse of a school that actually fell down behind my house in November of 2008. And some of your listeners may remember this happening because it made a fair amount of international news, especially in the States when it happened. About 100 people died. Most of them were students. And that building seems to have collapsed just basically because it was very poorly built. Even at the time, I actually went to the statistics and the U.S. Geological Survey to try to figure out, was there maybe a small earthquake or something like that? Some people thought that maybe it was because of the hurricanes that had struck about a month before. There's never been a clear answer. The one thing that we know is that the concrete that was used to make that building was typically shoddy. It was too thin. There was too much water content in it. There was too little rebar. The building was very poorly built, and what ended up happening was owner of that school was a Protestant preacher who, like a lot of people, was just sort of trying to make money on the back end because there's basically no public education to speak of in Haiti. About 80% of the schools are private schools, which there are these fly-by-night, really poorly put together institutions where the teachers don't have any real accreditation. Many of them haven't really had very much schooling themselves. And parents pay whatever they can. They pay these for what for them are exorbitant amounts of money to put their kids in these schools because they understand that education is the one chance that their kids are going to have to get out of poverty, not being able to evaluate themselves because often these parents don't have much education, so they can't really evaluate how good or bad the schools are. And because there was so much demand, the guy who owned this school just threw up a third story on the building, basically, so he could just fit in more kids and collect more tuition, and the whole thing collapsed, and it killed about 100 people. And again, this was just a little over a year before the earthquake struck. So you can imagine when the earthquake hit, there was that story told over and over and over and over again. I mean, schools that had collapsed, and then also luxury buildings. Some of the nicest hotel in the country collapsed. My house, which was a lovely house that the Associated Press had been renting for years, collapsed next to a hotel that also partially collapsed. The National Palace collapsed. The Palace of Justice, which is where the Supreme Court meets, that collapsed. And what was unusual about the earthquake compared to other disasters that had come before in Haiti was, frankly, how democratic it was, for lack of a better word. It didn't matter who you were at that moment. It didn't matter how much money you had or how long you'd been in the country or what you were doing there. If the building around you wasn't ready to withstand this earthquake, then it fell, and you may very well have died. And if you just happened to be lucky enough, as I was, to stand at a building that could fall apart but not implode completely, then you can still be here having this conversation. And it really comes down to, among other things, regulation. The fact that there isn't a state that's able to pass and then enforce building codes to go and have accredited and bonded construction companies that are actually building buildings that are safe enough to stand in. And what that story comes down to, in many ways, over the last 30 years, has been a concerted effort by the international community, by the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, aid groups, to go around the Haitian government instead of working through it, often because of the reason often given is fear that the Haitian government is going to be too corrupt. If we give them money, then they're just going to steal it. Or some people say, they just aren't educated enough. They wouldn't know what to do if we gave it to them. And so what's been created is what people often call the Republic of NGOs. And basically, this is a country where public services are provided either by these little private companies or by aid groups that come and they sort of do whatever they're doing, but they're not accountable to anybody that they're actually trying to help. They're only accountable to their donors, to USAID or to people who are texting them money or whatever it is. And what that has left is a place where there is no government. Even if the government wanted to steal the money, the government doesn't really touch enough money that they could steal. They certainly can't, enforce these building codes or these public safety standards. And so, if one school can fall down like that one did in November of 2008, it wouldn't have taken very much imagination to understand what could have happened when the earthquake struck in January of 2010. And I think what's really sad about the story and what really should get people's attention is that, almost 4 years after a disaster that killed between 100,000 and 316,000 people, those are the estimates, that those things are still not in place. There still aren't good building standards, and there still aren't good buildings being put up. And
did you address that in the book, like why and how, or is it just something you've observed?
There are so many reasons, no pun intended, that are structural, that are preventing things like that from coming into force. But yeah, all you have to do is look at the way that aid and relief and recovery and reconstruction were done in the wake of the earthquake to understand why this would be the case. There's much talk of money. A lot of people hear about Haiti and they say, Haiti, isn't that the place where we sent billions and billions of dollars and then nothing went done? But nothing got done. And people sometimes imagine that must be because they're so venal and they're so corrupt and they just stole all of it and this should be a cautionary tale. I had the position because I was a foreign correspondent whose job it was to track this stuff, to really be following it in granular detail. I was also at the Donors Conference at the United Nations in New York in March of 2010 when, a lot of those billions of dollars were pledged. And there's a whole lot of things going on there. One of them is that money that's pledged doesn't always get delivered. Quite a lot of it doesn't. The United States pledged $1.15 billion deliverable in fiscal year 2010. We're now in 2013, actually entering into fiscal year. We're now in fiscal year 2014, and most of that money still hasn't been delivered.
Wow.
A lot of that money was fictive. It's stuff like debt relief, which is the idea is basically that Haiti has some sort of fantastical debt to countries like the United States that it was never going to be able to pay. They were loans that were taken out by dictators decades ago, or loans that are in some cases even forced on the country. And so by declaring that the debt is now forgiven, we then pretend okay, well, the country has gotten $200 million from the United States, but it's money that they never had. And then the last thing, and what's very important to understand about the way that a lot of these aid programs work, is that money that we expect is supposed to be going to survivors of a disaster never actually comes close to the country where the place where the work is supposed to be done. It's money that goes from, say, the Defense Department in the United States to U.S. defense contractors. It's money that's paid for people to stay in hotel rooms in Florida and Washington, D.C., and wherever else on their way down. It's helicopter parts. It's jet fuel that's purchased in the United States and then burned off. It's food that's purchased in the United States and then delivered on a U.S. ship. It was $1 million a day to run an aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, in the Bay of Port-au-Prince for 18 days after the earthquake. And it's things like this. And so it really, one of the things that I hope that the book does, and I think it's doing for some readers, is to really call into question all of these notions that we have about how disaster relief really works, how international aid really works, how the relationships between these countries really operate, and to start asking more and better questions about it so that, first of all, the next time a disaster strikes, we know how to do a better job of responding to it. But I think much more importantly, understanding that these are things that have to change now so that countries can be better prepared, so that not only will they be prepared to respond to the disaster at the moment that it happens, but they'll have these construction standards, they'll have seawalls, they'll have whatever it is that they need to ensure that the greatest proportion of their population can survive, so that when a disaster strikes, it doesn't have to kill 316,000 people as the earthquake in Haiti did.
Wow.
Wow, Jonathan, this is very, very interesting. And where can our listeners purchase your book and learn more about you?
The book's available anywhere. You can go on to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I know Books and Books has it in Miami right now. But if you go to your local bookseller, especially the big guys, they tend to have it. And if they don't, please yell at them and tell them that they need to get the big truck they would buy.
Oh, Jonathan, it was so great talking to you, and best of luck. And I'm glad that you're having success with the book, and much more success to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for the conversation.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye.
All right, you're listening to Authors Corner on the Total Education Network, powered by Life Improvement Radio.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.